Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So let's start our discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen seven important articles, and four topics require a very comprehensive coverage as they are important for both prelims and mains. There are three small topics that are important for the prelims exam as well. So let's cover all these topics in a detailed manner so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. So before we start, I have a very important announcement. Those who are preparing for prelims 2026 and even those aspirants preparing for 2027, one thing you need for your exam is as much practice as possible for MCQ questions for your prelims. So Unacademy has launched the URTS, Unacademy Revision Test Series, which is a very effective compilation of lots of questions from all the subjects focused on your prelims examination. These questions are designed and moderated by the educators themselves. So, those interested to purchase the URTS subscription, please check out the details provided in the link that is provided in the description box below. And if you want the PDF of the Hindu analysis, please join our Telegram channel. After the session ends, we will share the PDF over here. So let's get started and look at the first article. On page number 6, the Hindu carries an editorial related to Trump's policies aimed at Greenland. Because just the other day, the United States has shocked its European partners by threatening them with additional tariffs on the issue of Greenland. So this has led to a shock wave across Europe. Some of the allies of United States, including United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others, they are shell shocked by the US decision to bring in tariffs on allied partners over the issue of Greenland. So, this is one of the most challenging geopolitical developments of recent times. This is a potential issue which can further escalate and it could destabilize the Atlantic region, affect transatlantic relations between US and Europe, and it could even render the NATO military alliance ineffective and degraded in the coming years. So let's dive a little deep into the topic and understand what the issue is all about with regard to Greenland. Why Mr. Donald Trump has set his eyes on Greenland and what are the controversial statements emerging from the US. See, ever since Trump assumed office for his second term, he has been referring to US taking control of Greenland either through a purchase from Denmark. US has openly suggested that they are trying to engage in talks with Denmark for a outright purchase of Greenland, which happens to be the world's largest island, and it occupies a strategic location. And Donald Trump has even threatened that US will not hesitate to use military action if necessary to occupy Greenland. So why is the US so keen on acquiring Greenland? That's something first we need to understand. Now, if you look at the map that is shared on your screen, you will notice that Greenland, the world's largest island, is strategically located between North America over here and Europe, located over here, and the Arctic region that's located over here. Especially in recent years, the Arctic region has acquired greater geopolitical significance due to global warming, melting of ice caps, and the abundance of resources present in the Arctic. It is estimated that a vast amount of unknown oil and gas reserves is present in the Arctic seabed. It is also estimated that plenty of critical minerals and rare earth elements are present in the Arctic, and Greenland itself is said to host plenty of resources which could be very, very valuable in today's times. So, in the Arctic region, there is enhanced geopolitical competition, a fight over these resources involving the Western powers led by US, European powers as well on the other side, and Russia and China. So, as Russia China's presence has grown and increased in this region, the United States believes that having control over Greenland is strategically important, not just for economic reasons, geopolitical reasons, but even from a military and strategic perspective. Now, when you look at the map here, you will see a narrow choke point present over here between Greenland, Iceland, and United Kingdom. This is the GIUK gap, which is a critical choke point where NATO maintains a very strong defense posture and a naval presence, primarily to monitor any Russian submarine activity. Since the Cold War days, the GIUK gap, or this critical choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and UK, has always been extremely relevant, as Soviet Union used to push nuclear armed submarines towards the Atlantic, towards North America via this choke point. So of late, Russian naval activity has increased, and China has been playing an increasing role, particularly to open up new trade routes and try and make investments in the strategic trade routes which are being developed here. China has even proposed that under its Belt and Road Initiative, a so called Polar Silk Road would be developed that creates a shorter link between China and eastern parts of Asia and the Atlantic towards the Western Hemisphere. This would significantly reduce the transportation time and the transaction costs, which would immensely benefit the Chinese economy. So, naturally, China and as well as Russia have a lot of strategic and economic interests to open up towards this region. And that is the primary excuse that US President Donald Trump has been using in order to make claims over Greenland. That Russia, China are posing a serious threat, that Russian naval presence and Russian missile deployments in the region, if it has to be countered by the US is insisting that they need a stronger military presence in Greenland. But however, let me tell you that US need not make any threats to Denmark, or it need not even negotiate a purchase deal with Denmark, because US already has access to Greenland because of a agreement which was signed with Denmark during the Second World War period. Greenland has been with Denmark as part of its sovereignty for nearly 3 centuries now. But Greenland has enjoyed its own limited autonomy. It has a very small population of hardly 56,000 people, primarily comprising of the Inuit tribe, which is an indigenous community of Greenland. So the Danish, they have extended this autonomy to the Inuits, allowing for local autonomy. But Greenland belongs to, or it falls under the overall sovereignty of Denmark. So apart from this, when Denmark faced a serious threat during Second World War, especially from Soviet Union, when Soviet Union was making rapid advances towards this region, even when Nazi Germany was posing a significant threat towards this part of the Arctic, Denmark had entered into an agreement with the US, under which US would guarantee security to Greenland, and US was allowed to deploy military troops and station weapon systems and even maintain military bases on Greenland. In fact, during the Cold War, this agreement would continue to hold, and US operated more than 15 military bases, and up to 10,000 American troops were deployed in Greenland. So today, the American military presence has gone down. There has been a significant reduction post the end of the Cold War. But the US still maintains a strategic military base, the Pituffik Space Base, which consists of air defense systems and early warning radars in order to track any submarine movement, naval deployments, and missile launches, and even to put into action any air defense systems required to intercept any possible Russian missile launches. So, from a strategic and military perspective, Greenland and the American military base located here is very crucial for NATO. The NATO allies have often relied on Greenland as a strategic launch pad to keep Russian advances and, of late, even Chinese advances under check. But as I said, there's no need for Donald Trump to threaten Greenland with military action, to threaten other European countries with tariffs, or even to initiate any purchase of Greenland, because US already has a legal guarantee from Denmark, which allows US to station troops and even enhance its military presence if it requires. So what you're seeing from Donald Trump is pure political posturing. It's purely a neo-imperialist agenda of expanding territories. But what's ironic is that even within the US, there is very limited support for such expansionism and territorial aggression, which Donald Trump is talking about. So, as a continuation of these policies of Trump, just the other day, US administration has delivered a big blow for European countries. Donald Trump has announced that a new set of tariffs would now be levied on European countries which are not supporting the purchase of Greenland and the eventual acquisition of Greenland into US territorial sovereignty. So US is announcing 10% tariffs, which is going to take effect from the 1st of February, not only against Denmark, but also against other European partners who are supporting Denmark's rights and sovereignty. Countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland from the Nordic Scandinavia region, and as well as major European powers like France, Germany, UK, and even Netherlands, they are being targeted with this 10% tariff that the US administration has announced. And if a eventual deal is not reached between US and Denmark by, by June 2026, the US administration is threatening that the tariffs would increase to 25% from the 1st of June. Please understand, just last year in 2025, the European Union and US worked out a trade deal, and there's already a 15% tariff on European exports into the US. They are trying to further negotiate and bring down the tariffs to maybe around 10%. So there's no guarantee as of now, or there's no clarity whether the new tariffs announced would be an addition to the pre existing tariffs, which were agreed last year under the new trade deal, or would it be a part of it? If at all, if it is made a part of the new tariff system, and if it piles upon the existing tariffs, then European trade to US, European exports to US would largely become unviable. And this is being seen as a blackmailing tactic by European leaders. Since it takes a direct hit at European exports into the US, this is being interpreted by European capitals and European leaders as a direct threat on the independence and the autonomy of European countries, and as well as a blackmailing tactic to subdue European nations and force them to agree to give up Greenland to fulfill the expansionist ambitions of Donald Trump and his administration. So, this is where the editorial is very interesting, very important, because the editorial clearly points out that these moves of the US is a clear reflection of the neo imperial strategy that you are witnessing. Any such move by the US, either through military action or even through blackmailing, coercive diplomatic tactics to force the government of Denmark to hand over Greenland, would result in rupture of transatlantic relations between US and EU. The transatlantic relations have been carefully built and nurtured over decades of effort. This would directly undermine the role and influence of NATO and keeping Russia and its expansionism under check, which could further threaten European stability as well. Now, if you look at the reaction of European leaders, French President Emmanuel Macron has criticized the tariffs and called it unacceptable. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also has said that such tariffs and blackmailing tactics against allies is completely wrong. Then look at the reaction of the leaders of the European Union. The President, Ursula von der Leyen, has also criticized these tariffs and coercive diplomatic tactics against allies. So, the underlying concern here is that if there is a rupture of transatlantic relations because of Trump's aggressive policies over Greenland, this could completely weaken NATO. This could even mark the very end of NATO as a military alliance, and it could embolden Russia to further step up its aggressive activities in Europe. And on the other hand, US would look to consolidate its position in the Western Hemisphere to fulfill its own narrow interests, leaving behind European countries to fend for themselves. In some ways, Europe has to blame itself. For decades, Europe has been very complacent. It hasn't spent enough on defense and security, relying heavily on American support within the NATO. Now, with NATO being directly threatened, on the verge of being dismantled, and any US action on Greenland, which could easily rupture and destroy US Europe relations, it would leave Russia unchecked in Europe. It would send the wrong signals for China to do something similar in the Indo Pacific or maybe in the Arctic as well, which will only increase tensions further. And you are going to see a sort of a neo imperial competition between US, Russia, and China to carve out their own spheres of influence and break down international rules based order with no respect for international law. Because what Donald Trump is doing has no basis in international law. The UN Charter under Article 2 is very clear that no country can threaten the sovereignty of another nation, right? You can't threaten the political independence of a state. And even issuing such threats, engaging in such coercive tactics is also prohibited under the UN Charter. So UN Charter not only prohibits military action and violation of the sovereignty of a nation, even issuing threats, practicing coercive diplomacy, threatening the political independence of a state or a region is strictly prohibited under Article 2 of the UN Charter. So, given US action against Venezuela, the way in which the president Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped, it raises alarming concern and prospects for Greenland as well. That if the talks between US Denmark fail and if European countries don't cooperate, there is a possibility that US might consider military action to aggressively make a military move to capture Greenland. And this would not only undermine NATO and US EU ties, this would essentially erode rules based order and international law and embolden other aggressive powers like China and Russia as well to resort to similar tactics. Now, if you look at the legality of these actions, even within the US, there is no basis for these actions of the US government. These are not approved by the US Congress, especially the tariffs which are being levied, including the tariffs against India. They have no legal basis. They're not approved by the US Congress. The US president is invoking his emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and using this extraordinary discretionary power to levy these tariffs against targeted countries. But however, the law itself doesn't make any specific mention of using tariff as a tool for geopolitical weaponization. So, under the Trump administration, you are seeing the dismantling of American legal system as well, a subversion of the congressional mandate and approvals. So, right now, there is a litigation in front of the US courts. And this week, there will be a very important ruling whether Trump can invoke these emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to levy these tariffs, to blackmail others, to bully others. Is it legally valid? That is something which is being examined by US courts. And there will be a ruling this week, very soon, which is likely to have significant implications. So, there is not just a lack of legislative backing, there is also a lack of respect towards international law and rules based order, as I told you. So, any further escalation here and any divergence between US and Europe would only embolden Russia and weaken NATO, which is in general bad news for transatlantic ties. And this in turn would have implications for India as well. India would not like to witness any further instability. India has already been caught between two sides, between Europe and Russia, US and Russia, in the context of the Ukraine war. So further escalations here will affect India's trade opportunities. India is actively negotiating a free trade agreement with Europe. We are in the midst of negotiating a trade deal with US to rationalize the tariffs, the 50% tariffs on India. So these ties of India would be directly affected. And if China were to resort to such aggression in the Indo-Pacific, maybe against Taiwan or against Philippines or probably against India as well in the Himalayan belt, then India would be left with very little support given these precedents which are being created by global powers like the United States. So, European countries are contemplating a counteraction. European countries have already brought out a counter tariff measure, which they are calling as the anti coercion instrument. This is an instrument being pushed by the European Union. Even Britain is backing this instrument. This anti coercion instrument, it threatens retaliatory measures against American trade interests. So, if this counter tariff facility is implemented by the EU and other European partners, this could restrict the access to American companies into European market, especially the tech companies. The US tech giants, the big tech firms, who consider Europe to be a massive and critical market, their access and their ability to provide services in the European market would be severely restricted as a reciprocatory measure, as a retaliatory measure. And apart from this, ever since Trump made these controversial statements indicating towards military aggression, European countries have deployed a small batch of troops in Greenland as part of an ongoing military exercise and surveillance exercise. And US is criticizing European troop deployment in Greenland. So this even raises the prospect of a potential military showdown between the NATO allies. That's why I'm insisting that any such escalation could possibly mean the death of the NATO itself. And such destabilization could have a cascading effect on global geopolitics, which would eventually affect Indian interests as well. So this is what we need to learn from this particular development. So this is a developing story. There will be recurring articles, and we will continue to follow this very closely. Now let's take up a prelims practice question. Let's see how many of you paid attention, and I want you guys to answer this question and provide the answer in the comment section. Which of the following is a critical choke point for NATO's naval defenses in the Arctic that is located near Greenland? These are your options. So please let me know what's the correct answer in the comment section. Now let's look at the mains question. Let's discuss the answer writing approach as well so that it helps in your answer writing. US President Donald Trump's renewed claims over Greenland and the announcement of tariffs against key European partners reflects a shift in the nature of transatlantic relations. So that's the statement which has been provided. So it's setting the context with regard to the recent developments related to Greenland. Then the question says examine the strategic, economic, and geopolitical implications of these developments for NATO's cohesion, Arctic geopolitics, and the global trading order. So there are three sub questions here within this statement. You need to examine the implications for NATO's cohesion, Arctic geopolitics, and the global trading order. And then how should India calibrate its engagement with both US and European Union in this evolving context? So how will you start your answer? In the introduction, maybe you can explain about the significance of Greenland. The significance of Greenland with regard to transatlantic geopolitics, the significance of Greenland with regard to NATO defenses, and its location in the Arctic region. So, if you can present the geopolitical significance of the region, that can be a good introduction. Or you can talk about the recent events involving United States, the policies of Trump, the statements, the claims being made, and how it threatens Denmark's territorial sovereignty and integrity. So you're setting the context with regard to recent events. So even that can be an introduction. So you can take either one of the approaches. Then in the body, you focus on the strategic, economic, and geopolitical implications. Maybe break down the answer into three small paragraphs here so that you can talk about the strategic, economic, and geopolitical implications. Maybe couple of points under each heading. Couple of points under each heading to bring out the strategic, economic, and geopolitical implications. So this makes up one part of the body, the first part of the body. In the second part of the body, you talk about the impact on NATO's cohesion. In just one sentence, you can point out that a rupture of transatlantic ties between the NATO allies could weaken the NATO itself, could possibly break down the NATO as a military alliance. Then you talk about the impact on Arctic geopolitics, how this could further increase tensions. There's already a race between major Arctic states and extra regional powers to compete for Arctic's resources. Right? You can highlight the competition between US and China, US and Russia, the rush to exploit the resources in the Arctic. So, with increased militarization and tensions, this could destabilize the Arctic and expose the Arctic region, which is so vulnerable for the impact of geopolitical developments. And then, what will be the global implications? How can this disrupt global trade? What would be the impact on rules-based order? How these actions of US are not based in international law, and there is no domestic legal basis as well for these actions of the Trump administration, right? So this can be a part of the last part of the body. Then as you bring the answer to a conclusion, talk about what should be India's response. What can India do? How can India navigate between US and EU? You can point out that India's stated position is to respect international rules, to uphold rules based order, which means staying committed to the principles of the UN Charter. So, by extension, India is expected, if not to directly criticize US, at least to oppose any such unilateral action on Greenland, at least to express concern about the statements and the policies of the United States. And parallelly, India should seek out closer ties with EU, trade, strategic, and military relations with the EU. And that's exactly what India has been doing, right? For example, for the upcoming Republic Day celebrations, India has invited EU leaders. And there are reports that we might be on the verge of a free trade agreement between India and EU, which has been negotiated over many, many years. The talks have been going on for nearly 18 years. And there is a possibility that the FTA might happen very soon as the Republic Day celebrations. So, point out the growing ties between India and EU, how India can step up the trade engagement, how India can insulate itself from the possible impact. You can even mention the recent visit of the German Chancellor to India, the kind of agreements we have signed with Germany, right? The close ties we have with West European countries, and in general, India's rejection of coercive diplomatic tactics. So, this should be a part of your conclusion where you highlight India's nuanced position, right? Of course, India will not directly head on criticize US actions, given that India itself has been at the receiving end of Trump's coercive tactics and blackmailing measures, including the penalty tariffs on India. So, India is parallelly negotiating a trade deal with the US. So, we would not like to derail the ongoing trade negotiations with the US. But at the same time, it's important to express concern with regard to the rules based order and the destabilization of the Atlantic and the Arctic region, which could have a cascading effect on global geopolitics. So take that balanced position, explain how India can work with both US and Europe, and possibly act as a moderating influence to tone down the tensions between them. So that would be part of your conclusion. Maybe one big paragraph of 4, 5 lines or 6 lines where you explain the nuanced position of India. So this would be a good structured answer with a logical flow of thought. So please use the discussion to practice your answer writing. And if possible, post your answers in the comment section. Now let's move on to the next topic. On page 6, there's a very important column that's related to the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988 and one of its controversial provisions, Section 17A. The reason why this topic is in news is because just last week on 13th of January, the Supreme Court has passed an important judgment in the CPIL versus Union of India case. The CPIL, the Center for Public Interest Litigation, is a civil society organization which uses the PIL route to protect the constitutional spirit and the constitutional ethos and to hold the government accountable. So, this organization had filed a petition at the Supreme Court urging that Section 17A of the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 be declared as unconstitutional. CPIL, the litigants, were arguing that this provision goes against the spirit of rule of law. Their argument was it is violative of Article 14 that guarantees right to equality and provides for discrimination, which enables corruption to flourish within the government with limited accountability and checks and balances. On these grounds, the litigants were arguing that Section 17A should be declared as unconstitutional and struck down. The Supreme Court, which was handling this case, the CPIL case, it was a two-judge bench which was hearing the matter that included Justice B.V. Nagaratna and as well as Justice K.V. Vishwanathan. So the Supreme Court has delivered a split verdict where Justice B.V. Nagaratna has labeled this provision as unconstitutional, whereas Justice K.V. Vishwanathan, though in principle agrees with the argument of Justice B.V. Nagaratna, has decided to uphold the constitutionality of this. So now this matter has been referred to a constitution bench, a higher bench of the Supreme Court, which would be headed by the Chief Justice of India. So now, based on the observations made by these judges, it's important to take a look at the background to this topic, understand what is Section 17A, why is it controversial, why are the litigants trying to argue that this provision is unconstitutional. To understand this, we need to look at the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 and the amended provision, that is Section 17A. This provision basically provides for prior sanction to be provided if a case of corruption has to be investigated by the police or by any investigating or law enforcement agency. Let's say allegations of corruption comes up against public servants, against bureaucrats, against ministers. If those allegations have to be investigated by registering an FIR, and if the case has to be pursued by the police or a law enforcement agency like the CBI, for example, according to this provision, the police or law enforcement agencies, they can't take up these cases unless and until prior sanction is given by the government itself. The government should provide sanction for the investigation, meaning the government should approve the investigation to be taken up, or else the police and law enforcement agencies, they are helpless. Even if there is prima facie evidence that a corrupt act has taken place within the government, such cases cannot be investigated under the law unless and until the government provides prior sanction or prior approval. Now, why was this provision brought in? Why does the government justify this? The justification is that you need to protect public servants who are honest. You can't encourage false complaints or complaints made with a malified intent to harm the reputation of an honest officer. In order to prevent frivolous cases coming up, because every time such investigation is opened up, then tomorrow the public servants will become double cautious, right? It will hamper decision making. They'll become hesitant to take decisions, especially those who are occupying the office for just 1 or 2 years. They would think it is safer to sit on the files, not take any decisions. Let the next officer who fills the position, let them take the decision. So this leads to red tapeism, slowdown in decision making, and it takes a toll on honest public servants and hampers the functioning of the government. So there is a legitimate need to protect honest public servants from false, frivolous cases and cases that are brought up with a malified intent. So there needs to be a balance between accountability to tackle corruption on one side, and at the same time ensure that honest public servants are protected from false cases. So government says this provision strikes that balance by providing for prior sanction, where the government decides whether sanction should be provided or not. It apparently makes a balance between the need for accountability and the need for protecting honest civil servants. But however, this matter has come up in front of the court several times. See, previously, under the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act, which provides the legal backing for the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation, which had a primary responsibility to investigate acts of corruption. There was a directive which had been issued by the government. According to this directive, if CBI or any concerned agency had to take up investigation of corruption cases, then prior approval of the government was mandatory. This was the provision that existed before. But this was struck down in the Vineet Narayan judgment, which is a landmark case that led to reforms with regard to CBI's very structure and composition. It led to guaranteed tenure for the director of CBI to make the CBI more politically independent. It led to the establishment of a new structure where the CVC would exercise a degree of superintendence over CBI to ensure that these are independent agencies to tackle corruption within the government. It also introduced new measures while appointing the director of CBI to insulate the agency from any political interference. Because before the Vineet Narayan case of 1998, there was a committee which was set up by the government of India, the NN Vohra Committee in 1993, which had tabled its report. And this report was quite shocking because it highlighted the nexus between corrupt politicians, corrupt bureaucrats, and public servants, and the criminal entities. The criminal politician bureaucrat nexus, which was brought out by the NN Vohra Committee, it had shocked the country. It was seen as necessary to crack down on the criminalization of Indian politics and the crony nexus that existed between the political executive and the bureaucracy and the criminal elements. So, for that, you need independent agencies like CBI, which can impartially investigate cases and crack down on corruption within the government. So, in the Vineet Narayan case, the Supreme Court had placed restrictions. It had done away with this single directive, declaring it as unconstitutional and against the spirit of rule of law. But what did the government do? The government tried to bypass the judgment passed by the Supreme Court in the Vineet Narayan case. The Vineet Narayan case, as I told you, was a historic judgment. It not only did away with the single directive that required prior approval from the government for investigating corruption cases, it also introduced reforms to the CBI to insulate the CBI and allowed the CVC to exercise a degree of superintendence on CBI to protect its independence. And it made changes to the appointment process. The security of tenure for the CBI director was provided to limit any political role in interfering with ongoing investigations by the CBI. But what the government did was it bypassed the judgment and brought out the CVC Act of 2003, which more or less revived the provision of the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act. Under the DSPE, Section 6A was the one which had provided for such prior sanction to be obtained by CBI before investigating acts of corruption. This was a single directive the government had issued before. So though Supreme Court had struck it down under Vineet Narayan case, it was brought back in a new form by amending the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988. Section 17A is basically a copy of Section 6A of Delhi Special Police Establishment Act. And not only that, Section 17A of the Prevention of Corruption Act has expanded the scope. The previous directive, the single directive, it covered the government officers only up to a certain rank, up to the rank of joint secretaries. And beyond that, only then prior sanction had to be obtained. But now, with the new changes to the Prevention of Corruption Act, this restriction was removed and it covers all public servants of all ranks. So it basically insulates public servants from any investigation and accountability unless and until the government provides prior sanction for the investigation of those cases. So this was seen as an attempt to protect corrupt officials and corrupt politicians. And this provision has remained in the law. It was challenged in the Dr. Subramaniam Swamy case of 2014, where the Supreme Court had declared Section 6A of the DSPE as unconstitutional. So it was introduced in a different form under Section 17A of the Prevention of Corruption Act with an expanded scope covering all the public servants, insulating all of them. And in any cases, the government will have to provide sanction. So this is a direct conflict of interest. That has been the point of the litigants in the CPIL case. And even the Supreme Court agrees that this represents a conflict of interest. Because any act of corruption involving public servants, bureaucrats, there would be possible involvement of senior officials, probably ministers and politicians as well. So they themselves will decide whether the case should be investigated or not. So the case is essentially against the government, and the government will decide whether the prior sanction should be granted or not. So this is a classic case of conflict of interest, a vested interest. So the government would most likely try to protect itself. It will try to protect its ministers, its officials, and top executives. So these sanctions which are needed may never be provided, and honest, transparent investigations may never happen, which would allow the corrupt nexus to continue and flourish. It's on these grounds that the law was challenged. And as I said, in the Subramaniam Swamy case, in the Vineet Narayan case, these similar provisions had been struck down as unconstitutional, but it has been introduced in a different form. So that's why Justice B.V. Nagaratna was of the opinion that Section 17A of the Prevention of Corruption Act should be held as unconstitutional and struck down. Justice B.V. Nagaratna was very clear in her judgment that this represents a case of conflict of interest. It is a violation of Article 14 as it leads to discrimination within public servants. It essentially erodes equality and goes against the spirit of rule of law. But however, the other judge who was part of the two-judge bench had a slightly differing opinion. That's why I said it's a split verdict. Justice Vishwanathan has taken a more balanced position. Though Justice Vishwanathan agreed with the assessment of Justice B.V. Nagaratna that there is a conflict of interest, that government giving sanction for investigating corruption cases would essentially defeat the very purpose of the law and it would enable the corrupt nexus. So in this aspect, Justice Vishwanathan agrees that yes, this provision could be treated as unconstitutional. But, however, Justice Vishwanathan doesn't disagree with the concept of providing prior sanction. Because as I told you earlier, in any corruption case, there is a need for ensuring accountability. There is a need to tackle corruption through honest investigations. There's no doubt about it. At the same time, there is a need to protect honest public servants, enable them to carry on with their work, enable them to make their decisions without fear of being targeted with false and frivolous cases and cases with a malified intent. So, keeping this in mind, Justice Vishwanathan has expressed a more balanced view that while the government can't decide on the sanction, you can't disagree with the very concept of prior sanction before such cases are investigated. This sanction should not come from the government, according to Justice Vishwanathan. It should come from an independent body. It should come from an independent agency like, for example, the Lokpal, which is set up specifically for this purpose. A body which is having very limited or zero political interference. Such a body, such an agency should have the authority to provide prior sanction for investigating these cases, to take up cases by the CBI or the concerned law enforcement agencies. So, when such protection is added, it will help protect honest civil servants. It will not impede decision making within the government. It will not create that fear psychosis, the fear element within the bureaucracy. At the same time, it will have enough measures to hold corrupt public servants accountable by cracking down on acts of corruption within the government. Justice Vishwanathan is of the view that prior sanction is constitutional. That prior sanction is something which is necessary to maintain a balance between accountability and the need to protect honest civil servants. But who will provide the sanction is the question. Justice Vishwanathan here agrees with Justice B.V. Nagaratna that the sanction cannot be given by the government itself. That's a case of conflict of interest. So the sanction should be provided by an independent agency such as the Lokpal. So now, since the verdict is a split verdict, the matter is referred to a higher judge bench, most likely to be headed by the Chief Justice of India. So based on this topic, please take up a mains practice question. This again is a developing story, right? There will be a major verdict on this topic very soon. So please focus on the CPIL case and its eventual outcome, whether the provision would be declared unconstitutional or not. The split verdict in the CPIL case is about protecting honest public servants while also ensuring an efficient anti corruption regime. Discuss. So, based on the approach we took in the previous question, I expect you to use the discussion we have had to write an answer to this given question as well. Now, moving on, let's talk about the third topic for today, India's relations with Germany, which has been in the limelight. Just last week, the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, was on a very important visit to India. Prime Minister Modi met with the German Chancellor, and around 27 important agreements, MOUs, have been signed that are spread across different sectors and domains. So, in this context, it's important to analyze the relevance of diplomatic relations between India and Germany. Why these ties are important in today's world. Please note that India, Germany, they represent some of the largest economies in the world, the third and the fourth largest, to be specific. Very soon, India is even expected to overtake Germany and emerge as the third largest economy in a few years. Now, this doesn't mean that India, Germany are at competition. We are close friends. We have a strategic partnership with Germany. We are trusted partners. Germany would actually benefit with India growing its economy even further. Right now, Germany might be the third largest. Very soon, India will overtake it. But this creates common opportunity, mutual benefits. India, Germany are very important trading partners, especially in the domain of technology, including the nuclear sector and as well as the engineering industry, with focus on micro, small, medium enterprises, in the domain of aerospace, in the domain of defense and armaments. So, across different sectors, India, Germany are key partners of each other. So, India overtaking Germany very soon is going to be a great opportunity for both the countries. We not only have common ideals and principles, we have common interests. And in today's world, where you're facing unprecedented challenges, a relationship like India Germany relationship can actually bring some stability and help counter the, the trend of uncertainty which is affecting global geopolitics. Given the tariffs of US President Donald Trump and how the international trade system is being eroded and broken down, how the multilateral world order is being eroded by the policies of US and even by the actions of China. It's very crucial for India, Germany to work together as two major economies and powers. They can help bring some sense of balance into the global economic and geopolitical world order. They're also part of an informal group called the G4, which has been pushing for reforms of the UN, which highlights their faith in multilateralism. Though the UN has not been effective in most of the global issues, it still remains the only hope for the middle powers and the weaker countries to address their concerns and bring up their voice. And India, Germany, both are part of G4 with Brazil and Japan. which are pushing for reforms of the UN and claiming a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, so that these four countries can play a more positive role through the United Nations to stabilize the world. So this again shows the common interest that we have. And during the visit, a lot of key issues were discussed, a lot of key agreements have been signed, and that is something we need to take a look at. So India, Germany, they also share concerns about the instability which is present in their respective neighborhoods. For example, India is deeply worried about the instability in South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh, and as well as in the larger Indo Pacific, be it China's aggression or the civil war in Myanmar. So there are a lot of challenges for India in its own neighborhood. Similarly, Germany is dealing with incredible security challenges in the European backyard, from the Arctic to Eurasia, especially given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has essentially threatened European stability and security. So both India and Germany share these common concerns as to how they can stabilize their respective neighborhoods. How can they deal with common security threats such as terrorism, piracy? India and Germany already have very close defense relations and intelligence relations as well, be it with regard to counterterrorism, joint military exercises, even anti-piracy missions. India and Germany already share a very, very close partnership. So this visit was primarily about taking forward these engagements and establishing new domains of cooperation. So during the visit, India and Germany have agreed to speed up the FTA talks between India and European Union, because Germany, which is a key member of the EU, is very keen on finalizing the FTA, the broad-based trade and investment agreement, the BTIA. The negotiations for BTIA started in 2007, but the trade talks have been stuck for a long time. It was delayed, it was dormant for some time, it has been revived recently in 2022, primarily over the differences between India and EU. As EU primarily consists of developed countries, their expectations are entirely different, something which a developing nation like India can't easily match. For example, they expect greater market access for European agricultural products, dairy products, meat products into the Indian market, because they're attracted by the massive size of the Indian consumer market. But India treats these sectors, agriculture, animal husbandry, as sensitive sectors. So there's a need to protect our farmers from international competition. And you can't simply open them up for a global competition with high quality products coming from Europe. So India has higher tariffs over there as a protective measure. That is something Europe disagrees with. Similarly, we have differences over the hygiene and sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which are very strict quality control standards expected by developed partners like European Union, be it in food products, in pharmaceutical products, in drugs and vaccines. They expect very high quality standards, something which a developing nation like India can't easily meet. We also have differences over the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which the EU is implementing to counter emissions with its trade partners. This is a carbon tax which European Union is implementing on its imports. So, for example, India's exports to EU, if they don't meet the emission standards laid down by EU, then those products will basically witness higher tariffs, higher import duties. So, this is seen as a sort of a carbon tax to force the trade partners, the producers in other countries, to match European emission standards. Though it might be good for climate action, this essentially allows developed nations to interfere with the climate policies of developing countries. So India completely disagrees with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. As any climate action efforts, emission reduction measures, they're part of only climate change negotiations. You can't make it a trade measure and levy such tariffs which could hurt the exports of India into Europe, as Europe is a big market, a critical market for India. Europe is one of the top three trading partners of India, comparable to US and China. So India has significant exports headed towards the EU. So such market restrictions and tariff measures could directly affect India's trade opportunities. So these are the issues where the FTA talks are currently stuck. Even with regard to labor standards, with regard to environmental laws, with regard to other associated regulations, be it the laws related to merger and acquisition, or dispute settlement, contract related regulations and laws. There are major differences between India and EU. Given the fact India is a developing nation, we have different priorities, different interests. Whereas EU, which mainly comprises of developed countries, they have different priorities. They expect very high IP standards to be implemented with regard to intellectual property rights. They expect very strict IP regime to be implemented. That's something a developing nation like India can't. Though India has strict IP laws, it won't match up to the standards of developed countries. So we are concerned about the evergreening of patents by European companies. For example, how European pharmaceutical companies, they make nominal changes to their products and they try to evergreen the patent to keep on earning royalty. So even life-saving medicines become unaffordable for common people, right? So India invokes compulsory licensing under the WTO and allows Indian pharma companies to produce generic variants of these patented drugs, which is often disputed by the European governments. So there are multiple such differences, and that is what is holding back the FTA. So right now, India, Germany are trying to push forward and accelerate the talks. And as I said, there is a lot of expectation that maybe the FTA could be announced by the Republic Day, as European leaders have been invited as a chief guests to participate in the Republic Day celebrations. So this is something which was very actively discussed between the two leaders. The trade issue was the primary focus of the visit. Apart from that, the second focus was migration. Because see, Germany is home to a very large Indian community, primarily made up of Indian students and Indian professional workers. There are more than 1 lakh to 1.5 lakh Indians in Germany studying in several top German universities, working for various German companies. And today, India is becoming the major provider of labor, that to talented workforce to the developed world, particularly in the STEM domain, in the domain of science and technology, engineering, etc. Indian human resource is something that many countries are looking to rely upon. So India would like to facilitate the easier migration of Indian students and workers. So Germany is reciprocating by trying to focus on migration partnership to relax the measures. For example, the transit visa that was required previously for Indians when they were transiting through Germany, this has now been removed. So Indians will now enjoy visa-free transit access if they are passing through Germany. This facility has been extended. At the same time, Germany would also like to address the problem of illegal migration, which takes place from India. Because Europe has been receiving a lot of illegal migrants, particularly from India, and this is a problem they would like to curb. So, migration mobility partnership agreements have been worked out to facilitate the easy movement of people, which could further create trade opportunities and improve cultural ties and people to people relations. Apart from this, both sides have signed several agreements covering critical emerging technologies with special focus on artificial intelligence. They have set up a special partnership on semiconductor manufacturing and fabrication in order to reduce their dependency on China controlled supply chains. They are focusing on critical minerals to create resilient supply chains and scout for these strategic resources which are needed to power the future economy. They have launched initiatives in the domain of clean renewable energy as well. They are bringing together the industry leaders from both India and Germany. So, a lot of these agreements were signed, apart from agreements in the field of education, healthcare, and as well as in the field of climate change. So, this visit of the German Chancellor was very productive and it highlights the importance of Germany as a key European partner. So, let's move on to the next topic. On page 10, there's another important development. US President Donald Trump has invited India, specifically Prime Minister Modi, to be a part of the Gaza Peace Board, which is being constituted under the 20-point Gaza peace plan. See, last year, Donald Trump, along with Egypt and Qatar, they acted as mediators between Israel and Hamas, which have been fighting the brutal war in Gaza over the last 3 years. The Gaza war was temporarily brought to a halt through a ceasefire under the 20-point Gaza peace plan, with Hamas agreeing to release all the remaining hostages. Hamas also agreeing to return the bodily remains of all the hostages, and Israel in return releasing Palestinian prisoners who were in Israeli custody. So eventually, the peace plan proposes the complete disarmament of Hamas, the de radicalization of Gaza, and the reconstruction of Gaza and the rehabilitation of Palestinians. So, to handle the reconstruction rehabilitation activities, the peace plan pushed by Donald Trump, negotiated by Donald Trump with Egypt and Qatar, it proposed a transitional body, a governance body, an international governance body, which is being labeled as the Gaza Peace Board, which would be headed by Donald Trump himself. The US president himself would be the chair of the Gaza Peace Board, and it would involve several leaders, technocrats, businessmen, and those with expertise in governance in handling Palestinian affairs. They are slated to be the members of this peace board. So US, which is now moving forward to set up the Gaza Peace Board, has invited several global leaders and uh, other stakeholders to be a part of the Gaza Peace Board. And India is one of the invitees. Similar invites have been sent out to Pakistan and many other countries as well, because under the peace plan, there is a proposal to deploy an international stabilization force in Gaza to maintain the ceasefire. The peace plan talks about a security force which will have troops from multiple countries, most likely, to be deployed in Gaza to maintain the ceasefire. There are reports that US is tapping Pakistan as well to contribute troops to the stabilization force in Gaza. But as of now, India is very cautious about this approach. India has made it very clear that we are not going to deploy troops in Gaza because this is not a UN peacekeeping mission. It's not happening under the UN banner. This is going to be a separate, independent initiative led by US and some of its allies. So India is not going to contribute troops to such a international stabilization force because it's not part of the UN peacekeeping forces. It's not part of the UN peacekeeping mission. So India is likely to stay out of contributing troops to the stabilization force, but India is considering the invite for PM Modi to be a part of the Gaza Peace Board because the Peace Board will decide on the reconstruction plan, how the funds would be spent, how to mobilize funds from across the world through donations in order to rebuild Gaza and to rehabilitate the Palestinians who have been displaced by this brutal conflict. So, this is going to be a challenging decision for India because it could create complications depending on India's role and eventual role of the Gaza Peace Board. It could drag India between Israel and the Arab states and Iran as well on the other side, leading to new diplomatic complications. But it also gives a great opportunity for India to show its leadership role and to play a positive moderating role to rebuild Gaza, which has been destroyed by this conflict, and bring back normalcy to the region and ensure that Palestinian rights are protected because India has maintained a consistent position to support the two-state solution for the creation of Palestine. And this might be an opportunity for India to play a greater role as a global leader. So whether India will accept the invite or not, it's not clear yet. But one thing is clear that India is unlikely to deploy troops as part of the international stabilization force. However, in another article on page 16, Israel has raised concerns about the Gaza Executive Board, which is being constituted by the US. Now, what is this Gaza Executive Board? The Gaza Executive Board will comprise of top executives from across the world, which will implement the plans that are approved by the Gaza Peace Board. The Gaza Peace Board, which we just discussed, the international transitional body, right, which would be headed by Donald Trump, to which Prime Minister Modi has also been invited, along with other world leaders like Tony Blair and others. They will be part of the Gaza Peace Board, which will be the highest authority to govern Gaza for the interim period before the Palestinian Authority is ready to govern the region, right? Until then, Gaza Peace Board will look after the governance and administration. So this is the supreme body which will help in the transition. So under the Peace Board, there will be an executive board comprising of top diplomats and executives who will implement the plan. It will comprise of technocrats, well-known officials who have served with the UN, who have expertise in Palestinian matters. They are being made part of the Gaza Executive Board, which is also being constituted by the United States. Now, Israel has a major problem with its composition. Why? Because the US has included the Turkish foreign minister and diplomats of Qatar, and Israel has an issue with this. The role being given to Arab state, the role being given to Turkey is something that Israel is opposing. Because Turkey has taken a stand against Israel with regard to the Gaza conflict since 2023. Qatar, which has been a mediator between Israel and Hamas, and the presence of other officials from Gulf states and Arab states, that is something causing problems for Israel because this restricts the plans of Benjamin Netanyahu, right, who has been quite open about using the opportunity in Gaza to try and exert Israeli control and probably to erase the right of Palestinians to have a state of their own. So, any involvement of Arab and Gulf officials and leaders is being opposed by Israel, and it is looking to take up the matter with the United States with regard to the composition of the Gaza Executive Board. Coming to the prelim section, let's take a quick look. We have three important articles, and let's go through them one by one. On the front page, there's an article referring to the Kaziranga elevated corridor. What is the Kaziranga elevated corridor? This is part of a new national highway being built in the northeast. It passes right through Kaziranga National Park, which is known for its rich biodiversity, including the presence of the famed one-horned rhinoceros. Kaziranga is also home to tigers and elephants, along with many other threatened species. So, to ensure that wildlife is not disrupted because of this new national highway that's being built in the Northeast, an elevated corridor of 86 kilometers is going to be built, and the project has been launched by the Prime Minister. So, the elevated corridor will help in the uninterrupted movement of the animals. It will allow them to move easily from one part of the habitat to the other. Because usually, such linear projects are the biggest threat for the migration and movement of animals in a forest area. Linear projects like roads, railway lines, power cables, they fragment the habitat and divide it into different zones. And it restricts the movement of animals and the migratory patterns. And this directly contributes to more incidents of human animal conflict or man animal conflict incidents. So, building such an elevated corridor will not only serve the economic and strategic purpose of facilitating safer and easier travel and connecting Northeast India with rest of the country, but it would also help in minimizing incidents of man-animal conflict and ensure that the migration and movement of animals would be uninterrupted. Coming to the next topic, on the front page, there's an article referring to an outbreak of GBS in Madhya Pradesh. Two deaths have been reported as a result of this outbreak. So, this is an opportunity for you to understand what is GBS, the Guillain-Barre Syndrome. So, GBS is a type of autoimmune condition, a very rare condition occurring very rarely. The concern here is that those affected by GBS, the immune system starts attacking the peripheral nervous system, assuming that it's a threat. So, anything apart from the spinal cord and the brain, everything else which is part of your or the nervous system, right, is treated as the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, which is crucial for movement of your limbs, movement of your muscle, etc., they will be attacked by your own immune system in this condition. This leads to even paralysis and eventual death. It affects the ability of a person to carry out basic mobility, like lifting their arms, moving their wrist, or standing up, walking. Basic activities could be completely crippled, as it leads to weakness and numbness in the locomotor systems and affects the movement and the mobility, leading to paralysis. And in some rare cases, if it's not treated, it can result in the death of the patient as well. Until now, the exact cause is not known. Exact cause for GBS, what triggers this immune condition, autoimmune condition, is not clear. And there is no specific line of treatment. It's only symptomatic treatment. And if the condition is caught early, the symptomatic treatment is likely to be more effective. which prevents the progression of the paralysis, and it is reversible as well if treated appropriately. But however, the exact cause is not known, but it's often seen that GBS follows major bouts of infection, especially when a person is infected by um, pathogens which can cause deadly diseases, respiratory diseases, including COVID-19 or gastrointestinal infection. Following such serious bouts of infection, patients report GBS, which is a rare autoimmune condition that gets triggered. Now, coming to the last topic for today, on the supplementary section in the second page, the Hindu carries an article that refers to the coconut root wilt disease, which is becoming a major nightmare for coconut farmers in southern parts of India. The states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. These three states account for nearly 82 to 83% of the coconut production in the country. And the coconut industry is a massive and a major industry for the agro food economy. So these three states are the primary producers: Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. And across the three states, this particular disease, root wilt disease, has been spreading over the decades, and it is affecting the productivity of the crops, and it is threatening the livelihood of these farmers. So, what is the coconut root wilt disease? What causes it? What is its uh, impact? That is something we need to learn. It is caused by a phytoplasma phloem limited pathogen, and it primarily affects the roots of the coconut tree. It results in the wilting of the leaves, discoloration as well, and affects the productivity. Eventually, the tree or the plant it becomes unproductive and severely affects the eventual output. So you will witness that the leaves, they look weak and droopy, gets discolored as well. It turns yellow and it curls starting inward, and the flowering cycle gets affected. Eventually, all the coconuts which are formed, they'll drop, and there will be no fresh flowering after the tree is completely infected with this disease. So this is a disease that traces back to nearly 150 years. First, it was detected in Kerala itself during the colonial period. Then it was limited only to a small region, but today it has spread to all the three states from Karnataka to Tamil Nadu. It mainly spreads through insects. Insects are the primary vectors. Even wind is responsible for transporting the pathogen, and as well as the wide spread of coconut plantations. They're spread across several hectares. So it's much easier for the disease to spread. So containment strategies is something which works, which the agriculture departments try to implement in coordination with the farmers. So this is one deadly disease which has been affecting coconut plantations in the country. So please make a note of these major facts. On this note, we bring the analysis to an end. If you liked the session, understood everything, please press the like button and let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll meet tomorrow again. So till then, thanks for watching. Have a good day.